If you've lived long enough, you've felt it. But what is it? Today I'm going to talk about the pivot, about men's purpose, and why this is an amazing time, especially for dominant women and submissive men, to be alive.
She's the owner of all terrain, and you listen to her reading in love. Women learn their place, where she makes the rules. Oh, we love. She's the owner of all terrain, and you listen to her reading in love. Women learn their place, as she makes the rules. Oh, we love.
I call it the pivot, a critical era of change from a male-dominated society to a female-dominated society. We are at the beginning of it, a point where a female-led world is about to become inevitable. The momentum of this is frightening a lot of men, but the irony is that the men themselves have propelled it forward through decisions and actions of their own. Nikola Tesla predicted that the point of no return would be around 2026. In 1926, he said that in 100 years, women would far surpass men in terms of intellect, and they would soon cease to mimic the ideas and the systems of men and make society run more like the society of the honeybee. Now, there's more on that idea in my book, The Pillars of Gynarchy. The pivot was first enabled by women's financial independence. Beginning in 1974, women were finally able to open bank accounts without a man co-signing. Those of us born in the 1970s, now entering middle age, have always known we could work, manage our own money, and rent or buy our own homes. It took another generation or two for that to really sink in, and for us to move away from a feeling of dependence into full autonomy. Around that same time, it was decided that our bodies were our own, and our choice of whether or not to give birth extended beyond the time of conception. In addition, the introduction of no-fault divorce in the 1970s meant a woman was not obligated to stay with a man for any reason. She no longer had to bear the burden of proof that he was harmful to her well-being. She could get out without any explanation at all. She was now an autonomous being. By 1994, women were allowed to say no to sex with their husbands. By law, a man could be charged with rape for forcing himself on his wife. This was also a first in history. Now, for a woman, getting married no longer meant that her body was her husband's property to use as he pleased. Soon, women came to realize that they could fend for themselves, whether they wanted children or not. Men's weaponized incompetence in the home, and the common phenomenon of deadbeat dads, showed women their strength and their own competence. It showed us that being with a typical man was often more of a drain than a benefit. He now brought in half the income and still did very little of the housework and childcare. In fact, a woman would also be his domestic servant, as he could come home from work, relax, maybe do a little yard work on the weekend. However, the management and running of the house was still women's work, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, within most families. And you can forget about sick days. Men were often so inept and uncaring that a woman could be in bed with an illness for a few days and come out of it to see mountains of housework undone. It only took a generation for women to realize that was not a deal that they were willing to make. Women tried educating men on how to do their share. All the time, they hoped men would come around and would evolve along with them to accept them as true partners rather than helpmates. Some did, if they actually cared about their wives' well-being, but many did not. It became apparent that women were only seen as having value to most men if they continued in their traditional functions as mothers and housekeepers, not to mention easy access to sex. Meanwhile, economics made it harder and harder for a man to support an entire family on one income. Being able to work was no longer just an option or a freedom for women. It was, in most cases, a necessity. This was the result of men like Reagan and his cabinet making changes that benefited only the most wealthy capitalists and harmed the average worker. Oligarchy began to take hold in ways that it had been kept at bay in the past. Many women abandoned the notion that a man would take care of them. By the second decade of the 21st century, women have become more educated than their male peers. They've sought out positions of more power and influence. The wage gap is beginning to close, and women can make good money. In fact, the internet has made it possible for a woman to work from home, even start her own business, and be able to care for her children at the same time. There was inevitable backlash to women's freedoms and independence. So-called traditionalist men began degrading women for abandoning their womanly duties and raging against feminism for having done this to them. "You'll die alone with your cats," the men wailed, projecting their own anxieties onto us. Meanwhile, men became 4 times more likely to die alone than women. So women just shrugged at the criticism and took a nice vacay with their closest girlfriends. Women's attitudes have been changing. They put up with less mistreatment from a partner. They initiate divorce more often. And the male backlash has further illustrated one thing very clearly to women. Marriage is optional. Having children is optional. And most importantly, men are optional. They'll have to make a compelling case for us to keep them around at all. The Me Too movement showed women that they had collective power to fight institutions and powerful men who abused them. Women began sharing their stories of harassment, molestation, coercion, and rape, and realized that they were not alone. It didn't just happen to a few women. They were not the unfortunate exceptions. It was happening to women on a large scale, to the point of being endemic. Bringing this to light changed their point of view forever. Men had gotten away with so much, and women had simply hidden it from view with their silence and their unwillingness to ruin men's lives. There would be no more hiding and no more protecting abusive men. As Melanie Martinez sang in her 2023 song, Milk of the Siren, "Don't be sad when these fuckers all drown." By the time the discussion of Korea's 4B movement went mainstream, a movement of women refusing sex and relationships and dating with men, there was already a gradual trend of women avoiding marriage or divorcing and choosing to have fewer children or no children at all. Men were already up against record feelings of loneliness. Articles were written about involuntary celibacy among men, how women's choices could lead to a drop in birth rates, and the disaster of having more old people and fewer young people to care for them as they came near the end of their lives. What those writers often neglected to consider was that in only the last 300 years, the human population on Earth went from 1 billion to over 8 billion in an unprecedented boom. This means that if population growth does not reverse course, for a few generations at least, we'll face the strain of resources being maxed out. Population growth tends to follow the availability of food, and if we reach that tipping point where there are more humans than there is food to feed us, there will be a generation or two or three starving and fighting to survive all over the world before things self-correct through hunger, disease, and armed conflicts. Slowing population growth is essential to maintaining our quality of life. It has to be done before we reach the breaking point of about 10 or 11 billion people. The wealthy don't care. They'll be fine. The more workers who are willing to work subsistence wages to add to their wealth, the better for their bottom line. So, of course, they will add their voices to this delusion that we somehow need more babies. Now, we have reached what I and others call the pivot, an era when women confidently assert that men no longer have the right or even the power to control us in any way. We understand that being with a man is simply not a necessity. Sex toys are often more sexually satisfying, and men are often more of a pain than a pleasure. Podcasters like Princella Clark have movements of tens of thousands of women swearing off men. Relationship coaches are advising women to wait 3 months before even kissing a potential male partner to see if he's even worth the energy invested in creating a bond. Of course, stubborn patriarchs are throwing fits, trying to reverse the rights of women, to end unwanted pregnancy or to have a no-fault divorce. They understand exactly what led to this moment, and they want to take it all back. But the truth is, the genie is out of the bottle. Women will not go back into their hell on earth no matter what happens. And then there's us, the gynarchists. We want to see women and men happy. We understand, as psychologists have discovered, that men do best with a purpose outside of themselves. That used to be raising a family who all depended on him exclusively for resources and protection. With that role ending, they still are happiest pleasing a woman and making her happy. Men do what women like because they get a sense of satisfaction from having the competence and the ability to see us pleased. Women can be men's purpose, and they can make our lives easier. For women, there's just no question that a man who is fully dedicated to your joy and well-being is light years beyond the man who sees you as a maid and a pussy to fuck, or as a womb to make sure his DNA gets passed down. Our bodies are ours. They can no longer be a mere function for men. The men that other men call simps are the men who will enhance our lives. They make their presence in our lives more enjoyable than being alone. They lift us up rather than trying to keep us down. They are the trellis to our flowering vine. They can still use their masculine tendencies of risk-taking and physical strength to add to our fulfillment. They can still contribute financial resources if needed. They are not lesser men. They are evolved men. They understand that women are the power of creation, the source of life itself. Even outside of procreation, we embody creativity, and we energize the men who serve us. The simps fully understand and respect that. They want to cherish us, and they will defer to our judgment on issues that affect the whole planet. They know we make better leaders in that respect through our cooperative, communal tendencies, our empathy, our big picture thinking, and our higher level of communication. And to be honest, we gynarchists all know women could not run things any worse than men have. We are bound to make significant improvements. Welcome to the pivot. It's that exciting point in history where women finally understand their inherent worth and collective power and choose to leave men behind, or, if they prefer, to choose better men. Those better men have been waiting for this all along, training for it, and longing for it all this time. To have a woman to serve and to make their life complete is their dream. Their egos and anxiety do not rule them, and they are better men for it. The signs of the pivot are everywhere, in songs, movies, TV, books, and the typical men feel it and they complain about it, expressing great annoyance and anger. But instead of women pulling back, worried that their attitudes will make it impossible to find a husband, they realize they don't need one and forge ahead, not caring what men think. And to those resistant men, that's the biggest insult. It's a real ego blow, the fact that they are no more than optional to women. They always thought they were entitled to us. The pivot will be quite an awakening. The growing pains will subside, however, when their lives actually improve, with women in charge.
Welcome to the pivot. You're gonna have to pivot with it. Women don't need you, so make them want you. Bow down, it's the pivot.